All right, today we're going to go over different approaches to the mind-body problem, and what we're really trying to do is to understand what those approaches really mean by seeing how they apply in different concrete situations. So to begin with, why don't you turn to the person next to you and define what physicalism is. So physicalism is the notion that only the physical exists, namely only the things studied by physicists. That's not to deny the existence of mental states, but it says mental states are physical states. So maybe there's different versions of physicalism, but maybe the simplest is what's called the brain state identity theory, that mental states are identical to particular brain states. So yes, emotion exists, happiness exists, but what happiness is a pattern of activation in the amygdala and maybe a certain balance between the left and the right frontal lobes and so on. When you specify that pattern of activation or the brain state, then that's what happiness is. And the same for any thought, desire, and so on. Any questions about that? Right, so now define with the person next to you what functionalism is. So functionalism states that mental states are a particular way of functioning. That's what they are. And it doesn't matter what the creature was made of, as long as whatever it was made of allowed it to function in that way. So that's a little bit abstract. Let me give you some examples. Imagine you picked up some circuit board you just found lying around, and you looked at the way everything was connected together. If you knew about circuit boards and how this bit triggered that bit, which triggered that bit, which related to that bit, you might be able to tell that this was a calculator. What makes it a calculator is just that when you press, say, 1 and times and 5, you get 5 back. As long as it functions that way, it is a calculator. And you could work that out just by looking at how it functioned. And what's important about it being a calculator is not what it's made of. As long as it functions in the right way, that certain button presses create certain outputs, then it is an adding machine, a multiplying machine, and so on. As long as it does the right job, that's what defines it as being a calculator. So being an adding machine is defined completely by how it functions. And it wouldn't matter if it was made of metal or transistors, or if you rigged up some neurons in a little lattice and you rigged them up just right so that it added. It wouldn't matter what it was made of. So the normal analogy here is software and hardware. Mental states are like software running on the hardware of the brain. So what's important for a mental state is the network of causes, cause and effects, that mental state participates in. As long as you got that pattern, that causal pathway right, you would have the right mental states. Now what that pattern is kind of difficult to say for any given mental state exactly, but we have some rough ideas. In order for a mental state to be a certain mental state, it has to take part in the right network of cause and effects, both in terms of the environment and other mental states. For example, to be anger means there's a perception of injustice, which then causes an urge for revenge. So unless you felt you'd been obstructed in achieving some goal and probably felt that that was unjust, and you had an urge to do something revenge-like about that, then it wouldn't be anger. If you had the urge to hug the other person and kiss them on the nose, that isn't anger. In the same way, we could do a similar story, and Aristotle was the first person to tell these sorts of stories, say, for sadness. For sadness, you need a perception of loss, of not getting something you wanted, leading to a withdrawal. I mean, unless you had that, it wouldn't be sadness or something similar to that. And what is a desire? It's something that, in the right conditions, tends to make you do certain actions. So the sort of functional story we need to say is, given certain environmental conditions, say, the perception of those, given other mental states, then this mental state will trigger these sorts of further states. Could be further thoughts. So to be in a certain mood is presumably to be disposed to have certain sorts of thoughts and to have certain sorts of desires. Desire to withdraw or desire to go out and greet lots of people. The desire to help or the desire to harm and so on. Or we can tell a similar story about perception. The perception of blueness means to be able to make certain sorts of discrimination. So what is blue? Well, you tend to say certain things to blue objects and different things to red objects. You tend to give the same label to sky and sea and different from tomatoes. So the ability to make certain sorts of discriminations could be part and parcel of what it is functionally and essentially to perceive blue. Does that make sense to people? So the functional story, by the way, it doesn't mean evolutionary function. So one meaning of function is, why did it come about that we are this sort of creature? What was the evolutionary function of it? Well, I don't know if, for example, schizophrenia as such came about for an evolutionary reason, although it might have done. But it needn't have done for the functionalist to be right, as it were, about what mental states are. So deep depression might be a bit of an evolutionary aberration in that maybe sadness has an evolutionary function. It tends to make us withdraw from situations that maybe in an evolutionary sense it was good to withdraw from. And maybe deep depression is just an exaggerated version of that. That wasn't actually good, we just came along for the ride. But still, in the sense of functionalism we're talking about now, there's a functional story to say about depression. What is it to be depressed? It's to behave in a certain way, to react in a certain way, to think in a certain way, to be disposed to have certain mental states in certain situations. That's what it is to be depressed. It's the disposition to think, I can't do that, everybody hates me, and so on. And as long as you have those right dispositions, you're on the right part of the causal pathway, you are depressed. The functional story is everything that needs to be told. Now, the functionalist can still be physicalist. Indeed, all the functionalist philosophers I know are physicalists. In other words, they think these functions are produced by certain physical states. You need something physical to do the stuff that results in the right functions. It's just that as a functionalist, you're not committed to a particular physical stuff. See, some people say, for consciousness to be there, for example, you need a brain. It needs to be this gooey stuff that's up here. And a robot will never be able to do that. The Functionalist says, I don't see why you need a brain, as long as it does the right job. You see, and you say a brain, but let's take your dog. I mean, if you defined a certain emotion as being a certain pattern of activation in the amygdala and frontal lobes and so on, well, your dog has a bit of a different brain than you. It doesn't exactly have the frontal lobes like we have and so on. Does that mean it doesn't have these emotions? Or couldn't have desires? But let alone a dog, what about an octopus? An octopus has a radically different way of nervous organisation in which it doesn't quite have the centralisation we have. It's more a distributed brain over the body. But octopuses can be very clever. They can learn subtle things. Now, do you want to rule out, just because an octopus doesn't have frontal lobes, it doesn't have an amygdala, are we going to say it can't have certain emotions? Well, functionalist says that would be silly. As long as it behaves functionally in the way that defines a certain emotion or what it is to have a desire, what it is to have a thought, then of course it has it. So if you stop the octopus from reaching for some food and then it seems to want to attack you, looks like we could have some right functioning there for the basis of anger. So the functionalist says robots, octopuses, all sorts of creatures can have mental states, consciousness, as long as they function in the right way. And one thought experiment that might motivate that is let's say we took one neuron at a time in your brain and we swapped it for a little silicon transistor that did exactly the same job. And then we proceeded to replace each neuron in your brain in this way. Would that still be you having the mental states that you have and so on? And if not, why not? Well, the functionalist would say yes, if doing the same job. Of course it is. It doesn't matter that it's made of silicon. But the brain state identity person has to say, no, I'm sorry, no more consciousness because you're not using a brain anymore. So that's the difference between those two positions, even though both tend to be physicalists. Well, the brain state identity person is a physicalist by definition, but a functionalist could have the right functions running on soul stuff. So you could be a dualist, a substance dualist and a functionalist. I don't happen to know them, but that makes a lot of sense to me. In other words, if I were to be a substance dualist, I'd probably want to be a functionalist at the same time. Any questions about that? And all of this, by the way, will become clearer when we go through some concrete examples. Now, the final position that we'll look at, and then we'll go through applying them, is dualism. So just define dualism to the person next to you. So dualism is the idea that there's two of something. That's why it's dual. And in particular, the physical and the mental are fundamentally different in some way. Now, that might be, like René Descartes thought, that there can be complete separation between them. There'll be substance dualism. What that means is, if the brain ceases to function completely, like you die, there's still some mental life going on. That's how different they are. But you needn't be a dualist and be a substance dualist. The other sort of dualist you can be is a property dualist, in which you say consciousness or a certain mental state is a property of certain physical systems. So you need the physical system there in order to have the mental state property. So maybe you need the right functional state happening. You need a sufficient complexity of organisation. But once you have the functional state that corresponds to that mental state, pop, the qualia comes into existence that corresponds to that mental state. Now, the motivation for that is your subjective experience of your mental states, that it feels a certain way to be happy, to see red, to desperately wish for something, and so on. That feeling a certain way, that what is it like to be in that state, is the qualia. And that seems to be a different property. It's just something completely different from a rate of discharge of neurons, electrical potential. So it in no way seems like a physical property. So it's a mental property. So it can't be identical to something physical if it is a different property. So that's the property dualist. And then the further distinction one can have is, well, when these mental properties come about, do they have any additional causal effects or not? So do qualia produce changes in how you exist because of being qualia? Changes in how you function, in fact. Or do they just pop into existence, and because the laws of physics are complete by themselves, they can't do anything? It just seems a certain way to be happy, but that feeling, the real mental state itself, can't change the laws of physics, can't affect physical systems, so it just sits there, epiphenomenal. Now, you could be a substance dualist and interactionist, or substance dualist and epiphenomenalist as well. So in fact, the substance, René Descartes was a substance dualist and an interactionist. In other words, substance dualists, the mental can be separate from the physical. So a substance dualist, for example, you could believe when people have out-of-the-body experiences, which 10% of people do, so you have the experience of looking down upon your body, that is because the consciousness has left the body. So that's substance dualism. Interactionist means, and then the mental states that exist from that point of view, that consciousness, can change what happens in the brain. It's causal. If you're an epiphenomenalist and substance dualist, I don't know any of those, but I'm just saying it's logically possible. Whatever mental states exist in the soul stuff, they have no causal influence on the physical world. So the substance dualists I know, say René Descartes, and various theologians that I know are interactionists, but the property dualists, sometimes they're interactionists, sometimes they're epiphenomenalists. So those are the major positions. Now the essay asks you just to pick three approaches. I'll just take those three. When you come to write your essay, you can pick any three you like. So you can pick three approaches to dualism, three sorts of physicalism, two of this, one of that. It's up to you. Whatever you're going to find interesting and believe will show off your understanding of those approaches to the mind-body problem. Now let me go through a couple of examples. So what I got left, what I'm going to say, is a couple of examples. I'll go through some findings in psychology, and we'll think about how the mind-body approaches apply to them. Hopefully that will help you think about the particular finding that you're going to talk about. So I'll leave you to talk about it, and then I'll wander around and listen to what you have to say, and then I'll come back up here and talk about some of the examples I've heard, so that you just hear lots of examples and see how you can think about the application of the different positions to the mind-body problem to different psychological phenomena. So let's take a claim like meditation increases happiness and reduces cortisol. So what's going on here? Well, meditation, I'll just gloss as attending in a certain way. So that's a certain mental state. The claim is that produces another mental state, happiness, and also changes the release of a certain hormone, cortisol, from the adrenal glands. So now, on the face of it, you might think what we have here is something mental, meditation, which is just attending and thinking in a certain way, causally affecting something physical, hormone levels in the blood. So isn't that a case of mind-body interaction and dualism? Well, bear in mind, for the physicalist, all mental states are physical. So when you meditate, and you do that by attending in a certain way, that would be, for the brain state identity person, a certain pattern of activity in a part of your brain. It would be a physical state. And there'll be nothing mysterious in principle about that physical state affecting another bit of the brain that sends messages down to the adrenal glands, because that's just something physical affecting something physical, right? And then that sends a nervous impulse down here that releases hormones, and that's just physical stuff affecting physical stuff, and there's nothing particularly strange about that, because it's good to work out the details of exactly how that works, but in principle that's how the story would go. And happiness would be a certain pattern of activity in the brain. And so what this finding amounts to is a new empirical fact we've discovered about how the physical world works, namely when brains go in this sort of activity, it causally produces this sort of activity. So what looks like, and in a way is, the mind and the body, or mental and the physical interacting, is, well, it is that, but that ultimately just is the physical and the physical interacting. Does that make sense? So that's what the physicalist says. Now, when you come to write up your essay, you don't have to know what is the particular brain state that corresponds to a particular mental state, because probably in almost all cases we don't know. If you happen to know something about that, flesh it out a bit, that's great. But don't do a lot of homework trying to fill in all those details, because filling in those precise details doesn't show a greater understanding of the mind-body problem. Because what I'm interested in, remember what the point of all this is, why I want you to write this essay is for you to show me you understand the mind-body problem and how it applies to psychology. So that's what the identity theorist says, and the functionalist would then come along and say, that was good work and we needed to do that, because ultimately everything is physical for the typical functionalist. But you've kind of missed the point. Yes, there was a certain pattern of activity here, but what made that a mental state, and indeed what made that in particular a mental state of attending in a certain way, is the way that it functioned. And unless you talk about that and mention that, you haven't actually said something about mental states yet. Because what is attention? Well, attention is a process that changes how information flows, so that when you attend to something, you get more information from that thing and less information from other things. And unless the brain state or system was doing that, was modulating the flow of information so there was more from one thing than another, it wouldn't be attention. And furthermore, it didn't matter that it was this brain state doing it. Any system that modulated information in the right way would be attending in that way. So to really make sure the story is about mental states and hence psychology and the mind, you need to say the functional story. That's what the functionalist says. It doesn't dispute what the physicalist says and doesn't deny that that was scientifically relevant and very interesting. It just misses out on what we're really interested in, which is mental states. And for it to be a mental state, according to the functionalist, it needs to function in the right way. So the functionalist story would say, well, we have this system that modulates information in a certain way, and when you meditate, you're doing things like training your capacity to bring your thoughts back to the object of meditation, or you're training yourself to attend in a calm way, or whatever the sort of meditation is. And then happiness is, again, a certain functional state. And in writing the essay, you could give an attempted functional definition of each of the psychological states. So what is happiness? It's, well, it would dispose you to, say, approaching people rather than withdrawing, to giving something a go rather than thinking that you can't do it. Maybe it's associated with feelings of lightness, and so on. Yes?
Yeah, or it's a bias in perception, so that you focus on stimuli that are experienced as pleasant rather than unpleasant.
Yes. It could be a certain optimism as well, a certain way of perceiving. Exactly, yeah. So you can tell you could say there's a functional story about what meditating or attending is, there's a functional story about happiness. And what this research has shown us is a new functional relationship that we didn't know before, which is this functional state of attending causes this functional state of happiness. And now this cortisol business, well, that is a physical state. And so the functionalist says, well, and one of the ways in which this happens to be physically implemented in the human brain is by triggering the release of cortisol. But the cortisol in itself is, well, that's what happens in humans. But you know what? We could probably program a robot up, and it'd be interesting to see if we could program it so if it meditated in a certain way, it caused happiness. We probably, we wouldn't need cortisol to do that. That's just what happens in humans. So that's the functional story. Now, the dualist says to the functionalist, the property dualist, anyway, says to the functionalist, now that was good work, and we needed that. The only thing is, you've missed out what we're really interested in, and that's mental states. So we need to tell your story, but then what you've missed out on is what it actually feels like to be meditating and what it actually feels like to be happy. You missed out the qualia. You missed out the stuff that we're interested in. So, what we need to do is tell your functional story, and then, well, for a certain sort of property dualist, we can say, when we get this function, this modulation of information in precisely the right way, what happens is, pop, a certain feeling comes into existence. The feeling of concentrating or attending in that way. And when that happens to cause this functional state here, what happens is, pop, a feeling comes into existence, the feeling of happiness. But you never mentioned that feeling, and I could imagine programming up some machine or something else that functioned in this way but didn't have any of the qualia. So there would be no mental states there. There would be no consciousness there. So we do need to add the qualia, but all we need to do is to say the qualia pop into existence when you get the right functional states. And that's what the property dualist says. And again, the property dualist says about the cortisol, well, that's part of how this system happens to work, but that the cortisol itself needn't be associated with any particular mental states until it changes how the system functions and therefore changes the mental states that pop into existence. Does that make sense? Now, the substance dualist, let's do something a little bit different, because the substance dualist says there's stuff the mind does and there's stuff the brain does, and they're different. So you have to put a boundary somewhere between the brain and the mind. And you say, up to here, this is what the brain is doing, but after this point, that's what the mind is doing, or the soul. So you'd have to think about where you're going to put that boundary. Where does the brain start talking to the mind, and the mind, where's the interface between the two? So attending in a certain way causes happiness. Well, is that because that's just the way souls work? Or is that part of the way brains work, and the soul picks it up from the brain? There's no obvious right answer to that, it's just something you have to think about, and you could come up with one possible story. So one possible story, to make it most different from the others, is deciding to attend in a certain way and directing your attention, those willful activities, is soul function, that's soul stuff. And happiness is something that souls experience, not brains. Now, psychology is in the business of finding regularities amongst mental states. So that's what psychology is. So the substance dualist says, yeah. And so what we're really interested in is finding regularities amongst the mental states in the soul. And one of those regularities, apparently, is attending in a certain way produces happiness. That's just the way souls function. And then that happiness can be, sends a message or causal influence down to the brain that makes the brain do certain things, like behave in certain ways, like open arms to hug people and so on. Yes?
Can we also take other positions?
Oh, yes.
Say the ones you just discussed, because I find the substance dualist position, if I try to make it up, it would just sound very plausible. And I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're free to take whatever positions you want. So I just bring up these positions just to show you. I just want you to know how these different positions would work in particular concrete cases. You're not at all obliged, in fact, to use any of the positions I'm talking about. You just use some of them or others. So now the substance dualist, in a way, has nothing further to say about any regularity. Well, unless you want to explain in terms of the real underlying regularity, like it might be that attending in a certain way blocks habitual negative thinking, and because you cut off cycles like that, that's why you become happier. So the real underlying law of souls is maybe something like a habit. The more you do something, the more you think or experience something, the more likely you'll experience it. But the functionalists and the physicalists have more explanatory work to do. So in terms of attending in a certain way producing happiness, you can say, well, why is that? So then you can start to think about, well, how does the physical system work such that it produces this? You see, the explanatory story goes on. You can keep asking why. Well, that's because there's certain neurotransmitters, and that's because when these neurotransmitters change in this way, well, look, it's going to have this effect because of the way these neurons are wired, and so on. let's take another example, and I'm really just going to do the same thing all over again. This was from last year. Someone said they were working on how, well, I think it was something like this from my memory. I mean, inducing a mood, happy or sad, a bit like you were just saying just now, biases your perception. So, for example, it means if you were put into a sad mood and then you saw an array of faces, the sad face would pop out more if you're in a sad mood. Okay, so that's the claim finding. The physicalist says, I can talk about that while just talking about physical stuff and physical processes. So the face is on the screen, well, that's something physical. Then there's light rays coming in, well, that's physical. Hits the eye, which is physical. The optic nerve starts firing. It triggers a face detector, which is just a bunch of neurons that fire when there are faces there, so that's physical. And then the mood is probably something like a pattern of connection strengths in certain neurons, which predisposes them to fire more one way than another. And that physical state, it's sort of enduring physical state of the neurons influences face detectors. So I'm just going to tell a physical story about neurons, light, computers, and so on. And again, the functionalist says that was really useful, and we need to know about all of that. But, you know, when you talked about face detectors, you're smuggling in functional notions in there. Because detecting faces is something functional. Something's only a face detector if it goes bing when there are faces there, more than when there are not faces. If it didn't do that, it wouldn't be a face detector. And what's important about this thing is indeed that it detects faces. So what's important is the function, and the really important thing, therefore, is the functional story that one tells. And the mood is, again, it's a functional state. If you didn't have the disposition, you wouldn't be irritable unless you had the disposition to be angry and to snap and so on. It wouldn't be that mood unless it had certain functional properties. In fact, any talk of, I say, face detector, that's representation. Representational talk is functional talk. And probably most of the stories you read in papers, when it talks about representation, cognitive processes, information processing, that's all functional talk. If it talks about, I don't know, there's some structural equation modeling, and this causal influence is mediated by this one, or this personality variable or questionnaire construct is related to that one, that's all functional talk. Just talking about a causal network between different mental or psychological states and the environment. So probably most of what you're reading about, you already are given a functional story in the paper that you're reading. I mean, if it talks about, and this brain area lit up, that's now about physical things. But any use of psychological terms and how this psychological state caused that psychological state, that's functional talk. So in terms of the functional explanation, you can just probably lift from the paper how it's explaining the finding that you got, yes.
Would be the brain identity, you know, how's that called?
Brain identity theory.
Yeah, brain identity theory. Would that be if, say, someone says X person was missing this part of the brain and therefore they weren't experiencing fear? Or, I don't know, say...
Yes, so if there was a certain brain lesion and they no longer had a certain, you know, they couldn't reason in theory of mind, or they didn't have experience a certain emotion anymore. The functionalist...
Would that be a brain identity approach?
For any finding you can give me, I'm willing to bet any of these approaches can explain it. The one that often has difficulty is substance dualism, but all the others will be quite smug and happy and say, yeah, I can explain that. Okay? So the functionalists would say, well, it's the functioning of the system that counts, and say it's functioning the right way that is experiencing fear. Now, if you're going to pull out some of the guts of the system so it can't function anymore, well, if it functions differently, you're going to have different mental states. And for example, you may no longer be able to experience fear because you don't function in that way anymore. So the functions will be perfectly happy. And the property dualist would say, yeah, and if you change the way the system works, those mental state properties don't pop into existence anymore, or different ones do. Does that make sense? So let me now have given you some ways of approaching this. Now, talk with the person next to you about the finding that you're going to interpret, and it can be as general as I've got here. That's sort of all the detail that we really need. And then just go through the different approaches to the mind-body problem and think about, well, how do they apply in this case? Okay, let me describe some of the things you've been talking about, just to give you more ideas. So one example back there was that women who are afraid of being victims of crime were more likely to choose aggressive males as partners, probably mediated by a belief that a more macho male would be better at protecting you from the baddies. So that's the finding. Now, in a way, we've already got the skeleton of a functional account there, because it's talking about relationships between different mental states, a causal pathway between different mental states. But what you'd want to do to show you really understood functionalism is to say, okay, let's take the belief that I'll be, the fear that I'll be a victim of crime. What we want is a functional account of what that is. So that doesn't mean why do you have it necessarily. It's not that you say, why do I have a fear of being a victim of crime? It's to protect myself. So in a sense, you can say that's one meaning of the word function. The function of it is to protect you in some way. But what the functionalist is really after is not why you have it, but what is it? How do you have to function so that you have that fear? Well, you're only afraid if you do and feel certain things in certain circumstances. So to be afraid of crime means that you avoid situations where there's any possibility of crime. Or that you tend to have certain thoughts when someone says, oh, that's a bad neighbourhood. If you have the thought, my God, I shouldn't go there, and so on. So what you've got to think about is, how would a person have to function to be in that state? What is it that makes that state that very state? And then come up with a functionalist account of it. And what is it to be attracted to aggressive or macho men? Yes?
In terms of kind of citations, say if I write up my understanding of that, like my understanding of the functional account about the statement, do I have to cite that?
So the question is about what do you cite. Now, I'm not...
Because it sounds a bit complicated, like say if I go there, oh, it's probably to have these kind of thoughts, such as being alert to someone saying, oh, this is a bad neighborhood, but then do I cite that, for example?
The rules of citation are exactly the same as any essay, in that if you drew on some previous work and that's influenced your thinking, then you should acknowledge that influence. If you just thought it up yourself, then you don't need to cite anything. So remember, for most of these mental states, we don't really have It's not as if the functionalists work out the definitive functional explanation for any mental state. So a lot of this really will be you thinking about it. So, for example, what's the functional account of what it is to be attracted to macho men? I don't think you'll find a paper or a book that describes that. So you just think, well, what would it be to be attracted to macho men? Well, if you're at a party and there's a macho guy there and there's a sensitive guy doing some knitting over there, which one do you gravitate towards? Which one do you move towards? With which one do you feel flustered? And so on. So you think about the behaviours and other mental states that should be triggered by an attraction to macho men. And then that is the functional account of what it is to be triggered to macho men. They don't have to get that exactly right, because as I say, there is no exactly right answer. So just say something that shows this is the sort of ballpark we're talking about. It's these sorts of behavioural tendencies, thinking tendencies, and these sorts of other states that tend to be triggered that would mean you are in this state. So that's how. So now what the functionalist says is, well, we have this functional account of fear of being a victim. We have this functionalist account of attraction to macho men. What this finding is a new empirical functional relationship saying that this functional state tends to trigger this one, perhaps because of a belief in the capacity of macho men to beat up baddies. And that belief is, again, another functional state. And what the paper is doing is linking these functional states in a new causal pathway. What the physicalist says is, yeah, there are these functional states, but they're all implemented in physical stuff. And everything you spoke about is a brain state. A fear is a certain brain state. It's amygdala and prefrontal cortex firing in certain ways. Belief is a tendency to go into certain brain states and so on. Does that make sense? And of course, what the dualist says is, yeah, you spoke about attraction as a tendency to gravitate at parties towards the tough-looking guy, but what have you missed out? You missed out the feeling of attraction. What is it actually like to feel attraction? It's all very well talking about these functional states, but what about the feeling of attraction itself? So that's got to pop into existence when you're in the right functional state, if you're that sort of property dualist. Or another example was saying self-affirmations, in other words, that saying to yourself things that you're good at or virtues that you have leads to well-being, was the finding. Well, what is it to think a certain thought like, I'm good at playing the piano? It's to have certain representations in your head, representation of the eye, representation of being good at something, representation of piano. And you strung those representations together to form your inner sentence, I'm good at playing the piano. But a representation is just a functional state, according to the functionalist. Not say according to Searle, you may have read, it's on the reading. According to the functionalist, representations, we don't really have the full functional story, but it's something like a representation has the function of indicating things in the world. So a representation for piano has the function of indicating pianos. Representations are functional things. So sentences and words in your head are functional states. What is well-being? Well, it's a disposition to have certain feelings, disposition to have certain thoughts like, yes, I can do that and I'm going to give it a go. So we can give a functional account. As I started with functional because often the finding that you'll be talking about is already half a functional account anyway. And then what does the physicalist add? The physicalist says, well, really going on underneath all of that are the physical states. Thinking I'm good at playing the piano is a pattern of activation. If you have these patterns of activation not often enough, they change patterns of connection strength. And well-being is having a certain pattern of connection strength in certain neurons, namely patterns of connection strength that predispose you to have activities that correspond to feeling good, having thoughts that you can do things, and so on. Any questions? I hope, is this starting to make sense as I go through these examples? So when you write your essay, what you want to do is just be really short about the finding, really short about defining the positions, and then spend most of it applying the positions to the finding. Because that's, spend most of your essay actually answering the essay question. Now, you can talk about criticisms of the different positions. You should talk about criticisms, but use your finding to talk about the criticisms. So in other words, don't rehash what's in the textbooks with their examples. Use your example. Think about how does the argument translate when you're using your particular example. And it's similar to what I've just been doing. So the property dualist, the dualist criticizes the functionalist for saying, but what you've missed out is the qualia, the feeling in itself. So you describe that with respect to your position. The dualist might say, can you imagine a creature that, or a person that had all the right functions here, a face detector, something here that makes you tend to withdraw or approach and so on, but had none of the feelings. The actual, what it's actually like to be in that state of happiness, sadness, seeing faces. As long as you can do that, then there seems to be, so the dualist claims, something more to mental states than just functioning. But what the functionalist could say is, well, hang on a minute, these mental states, you say, talk about popping into existence. Do you say they have no causal powers? So being in a state of happiness, does the qualia have no causal powers? In other words, you're epiphenomenalist. In which case it's useless. Why postulate it at all if it has no effects whatsoever? It seems gratuitous. So that could be criticism of dualism. Or if you say it does have causal properties, why don't we just build that into the functioning of the physical system? So if you're saying if happiness has some causal powers above and beyond what the neurons are doing as a physical system, why don't we just tell me what those causal powers are and we'll build them into how the neurons work? Or normally there's a example I gave in my lecture of spectrum inversion. When I see red, could you be seeing blue? When I see blue, you're seeing red in terms of the qualia, but we function, whenever there's a tomato we both say red, and whenever there's sky we both say blue, but could the feelings we're having, the actual qualia, be swapped around? That's the inverted spectrum argument against functionalism. You can give an example with mood if it's mood here that you're talking about. Could you swap around the feelings of happiness and sadness? The counter argument to functionalism doesn't work quite so well then, and that's interesting, I think. But my point is, however you want to think through these issues, use your experiment to think through the arguments for and against each position. So you show you understand it because you're applying the arguments in a completely new context. Now, at the end of your essay, you can come down on one side or the other of any of the positions. You could say you prefer this position or that position. But the essay doesn't require you to do that. You can leave that completely open, and I don't mind what you do, because there is no right answer that everybody's agreed to. Yes?
But if we were to think of it in terms of like probabilities, there's some answers that seem more probable given what we know than other answers, right?
Yeah.
Like other explanations.
Yeah. If you want to argue one position is more probable or plausible than another,
Yeah.
absolutely fine. But don't do this. Don't give the pros and cons for each position and then say at the end of it, oh, but I prefer this one out of the blue. So what you want, and what's true of any essay, is the conclusion follows from the argument that led up to it. So if you prefer one of the positions, build in that preference to how your essay works through. So when you come to the conclusion, it's clear that is the conclusion. Okay. So, and also just to make clear, the marking criteria for this are no different from any other essay. I know this probably feels different to you as a topic, but it's, as long as you're answering the question using good structure, then you're doing the right thing. There's no sort of hidden agenda that I've got, right? I want you to show me you understand the basics of the mind-body problem, because 1,000 words you can't get into too much, just that you understand the basics of the mind-body problem. You demonstrate that to me by how you apply it to a psychological finding using a structured essay. And there's nothing extra beyond that. So I think that's everything I want to say, but let me, if you want to carry on talking, I'm going to carry on wandering around and talking to you. If you've got any questions, just put your hands up. And anything that comes up I feel might be good to say, I'll come back up here and say it.